Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos I'm doing about combat in video games, which is in turn part of a larger suite of videos that I'm doing about game design. And they're designed for anybody who wants to get interested in practicing and doing some game design. Maybe you want to do it for fun, or you're hoping towards getting a career in games design. And they're based on material that I use for teaching on my game design module at Northumbria University. So I don't always give that little spiel, but we've done it today. In this particular video, I want to focus in, as I often do in these series of videos, on some design thoughts. And I want to kind of step back. We've been looking at in previous videos in this series, been looking at some of the nitty-gritty of combat and designing of combat systems. In this video, I'm going to, as I say, step back and think about things in a bit of a higher level way. And I want to do this as a series of questions, really. And these are questions that, if you're designing a combat system, that I would encourage you to be asking yourself as you are designing this. I'm not presenting any answers. I might throw in a couple of suggestions here. But it's all about getting that player experience up to scratch. So I guess the first question is, because it's appeared on the screen, how important is combat in your game? If you're designing a game with no combat in, obviously it's not at all important. If you're designing an RPG, is it all about the combat? Is it about other things? Is it about relationships between factions and doing jobs for people? If you've got some games there's a little bit of combat, so immediately coming to my mind is Stardew Valley, which is mostly about farming and relationships, but has also got some stuff in it about with combat in as well. And the depth and complexity of your combat system will depend on the importance of your combat to your game. And I guess along with that is the question of, how do you want combat to feel in your game? What kind of feelings do you want the player to have as they're engaged in combat? Do you want them to feel powerful? Do you want them to feel threatened? Do you want them to feel excited? Do you want them to feel, is it funny combat? Is it, comedic combat? And then the next question is, what combat paradigm are you going to use? So in the previous video, I went through a whole set of different approaches that have been used in combat. There are more than the ones that I showed there. And what approach are you going to take? What's your basic underlying principle for your combat? And the next few questions about how you're going to tailor your combat to make it hit certain aspects. So how are you going to make it fun? And this is one of my game design rules. And the next is, how are you going to make it interesting? So this is about tactical choice. So here's another of my game design rules. Next, how are you going to make it varied? How are you going to make it so that not all the combat experiences the player has in the game are the same? Or are you? Are you going to make it so that combat always feels exactly the same? And if you are, why? Because that's the sort of thing that I would want to ask. Have you got a definite reason for doing that? If you do, that might be a legitimate design choice. But if not, then you probably do want to make it varied in some way. Here's another of my rules. And then the last of the short set, how are you going to make it challenging? How are you going to make it so that the player doesn't feel like they automatically just win every time they engage in combat? And again, here's one of my rules. So moving on, how are you going to reward the player? What are you going to do when the player succeeds in combat? And there are kind of two normal aspects to this. Yeah, there are more ways of doing it than this. One of them is to give them XP if you're in that kind of game, and the other is to give them items or drops. But I guess if going through that enemy means they can progress to the next area, then linear progress, special progress games, that's the reward that you get, being able to go on. There's all sorts of other things that you might be able to do. So um, this is kind of tied into that previous rule about challenge, risk, and reward. How are you going to use the fact that the players have to have a challenge to give them some kind of reward which spurs them on? How are you going to make your combat significant? Are you going to make your combat significant? How are you going to make it so that it's an important part of your game? For some games, this is really obvious. For others, it's less obvious. Are you going to make it so that there are certain combats which have story significance? How are you going to make it so that the player is engaged with this combat and it's important to them that they succeed? And so that's it for my questions. I've just got an observation to finish off with, which is actually this is kind of an observation that applies in lots of different areas of game design, but it certainly applies in combat, which is that if you have a situation in which something is always the same, it becomes boring. Especially, I want to talk about if you've got the situation where your tactics that you use in combat, you've got some killer tactics that always work. And so you never vary what you're doing because the enemy always uses the same tactic, always is of the same strength, always in the same kind of configuration. So everything is the same. Um, or even if they're not all the same, if it's all very predictable, if you've got a situation where the player can say clearly, this is what I need to do, this is going to be the outcome, and I can predict that beforehand, then that's quite boring. The opposite end of the spectrum is that if the outcome is always random, applying this to combat, whenever the player engages in combat, they really have no idea whether they're going to succeed or not because they don't know what's going to happen. And effectively, it may be more complex than this, but if the outcome from your combat is merely the roll of a dice, and if the player manages to get 3, 4, 5, or 6 on a six-sided dice, they win, and if they don't, they lose. Then you take away any feeling that the player has any agency in this. It's just a random thing. Again, there are situations in games where this might be a way to approach combat, but you would have to have good reasons for doing it this way. So, but if you do it this way, you will not have that feeling that the player can get that kind of feeling of smugness of I've done it right, because actually the power has been taken away from them. Somewhere in between those two outcomes, from the extreme of randomness and the extreme of determined, by which I mean that you always have a cause and effect, you know the output from the input. Somewhere in between, there's a sweet spot or a sweet area where things aren't guaranteed, but there is a reasonable chance that if you use these particular tactics in this situation, that you'll succeed. And I actually strongly believe that somewhere in between these two extremes is the area where emergent gameplay happens as well. That's where you start to find patterns in gameplay that weren't necessarily designed in. Anyway, those two extremes are bad. I would say avoid them, especially in combat. Somewhere in between is good. And a lot of games of all kinds, and not just video games, succeed well when they have elements of skill involved and elements of luck involved as well. And the two things combined, especially when it's player versus the game, not so much if it's player versus player, where it should be more based on skill. But with luck, a little bit of luck involved can make this sweeter, but certainly a lot of tactics. Anyway, I feel like I've waffled on about that a little bit, maybe a little bit too long. So I'm going to stop now. That's it from me for now.